Hi, welcome back to my channel Economic Lectures. Hope you all are doing well. In the previous video, we discussed about the comparative cost advantage theory of international economics. In this video, we'll be discussing further about the theories that comes under international economics. And of course, you might be knowing about the Heckscher-Ohlin or the factor proportion model. So this is one of the important model that comes under international economics, and of course, it's a continuation of the comparative cost advantage theory, which was put forward by David Ricardo. So, hope you have watched the previous four videos on international economics, and this is the continuation of that videos. Okay, let's go into the video. Let's go into the discussion of this topic, that is the HR model or the Heckscher-Ohlin model. The factor proportions model or the Heckscher-Ohlin model. The Heckscher-Ohlin, the HR model is also known as factor proportions model. Was originally developed by two Swedish economists, the Eli Heckscher and his student Bertil Ohlin in 1920s. So it was developed by Eli Heckscher and his student Bertil Ohlin. That's how we call it as Heckscher-Ohlin. Many elaborations of the model were provided by Paul Samuelson after the 1930s, and thus sometimes the model is referred to as Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson model. Again, after the 1950s, that is in 1950s and 1960s, some noteworthy extensions to the model were made by Jaroslav Ivanek. And so occasionally the model is also called as Heckscher-Ohlin-Vanek model. But ultimately we call it as HR model or the Heckscher-Ohlin model, and simply in generic terms or in generic words we call it as factor proportions model. The HR model incorporates a number of realistic characteristics of production that are left out by the simple Ricardian model. Recall that in the simple Ricardian model, only one factor of production labor is needed to produce goods and services. So, as I said in the introduction, Heckscher-Ohlin model is a continuation or an updated version of Ricardo's comparative cost advantage theory. So in the Ricardian model, he has skipped many of the basic concepts, basic things. That is, in the Ricardian model, we know that he uses only one factor of production, that is labor. He uses only labor as the factor of production. But when it comes to HR model or the Heckscher-Ohlin model, we uses all the factors of production. That is the basically the capital and the labor as factor of production is used in this model. In this way, the HR model brings many realistic characteristics into the model. The classical comparative cost theory did not satisfactorily explain comparative cost of producing various commodities differ as between different countries. So when it comes to the comparative cost theory, that is the classical theory, it did not explain what was the reason between the difference in the comparative cost between different countries. We said that in the comparative cost advantage theory, we said that the cost of producing certain goods between both countries are different. Comparatively, the cost is different. So, considering the opportunity cost, where there is a less opportunity cost, that country will produce that good, and the other country which has the less opportunity cost in another good will produce that good. That's how we set the comparative cost theory. But we did not explain, or Ricardo did not explain, what was the difference that resulted in different comparative costs. Did not satisfactorily explain the reasons for the comparative cost or what made the difference in the comparative cost. The new model propounded by Heckscher and Ohlin went deeper into the underlying forces which causes differences in comparative cost. So what HR model does is that it explains what was that cause or what was the reason for the difference in the comparative cost. The Heckscher-Ohlin model explains mathematically how a country should operate and trade when resources are imbalanced throughout the world. So what Heckscher-Ohlin model, the HR model explains is that how a country should operate and trade when resources are imbalanced throughout the country, throughout the world. We know that the resources are not equally distributed all over the world. There is an imbalance for the availability of resources. So when such a condition is there, how does the country should operate and trade when they have differences in resources? It pinpoints a preferred balance between two countries, each with its resources. So along with its resources, Heckscher-Ohlin model puts forward that countries can reach in a balanced situation. The standard HR model begins by expanding the number of factors of production from 1 to 2. In the comparative cost advantage theory, we considered or we assumed only one factor of production, but HR model expands it to two factors of production, or basically the capital and the labor. The model assumes that labor and capital are used in the production of two final goods. Another assumption is that two factors of production and two goods within each country, and the model also assumes there are only two countries. The HR model assumes that the only differences between countries are the variations in relative endowments of factors of production. So what HR model assumes is that the only difference between both these countries, that is country A and country B, is that the factor relative endowments of factors of production. Two factors of production, we said it's the capital and labor. So what the difference between two countries is that it's the relative endowments. So what is a factor endowment and what is relative endowment, we'll be saying in the next slide. The model emphasizes the benefits of international trade and the global benefits to everyone when each country puts the most effort into exporting resources that are domestically naturally abundant. So what does this model say? The model says that by international trade, each and every country can benefit. So in order to get benefited, what a country should do, a country should export resources, export the commodities which are made using the resources that are domestically naturally abundant. For example, if capital is abundant in your country, then you should produce goods that require more capital. If labor is abundant in your country, then you should produce goods that require more labor. All countries benefit when they import the resources they naturally lack. And the theory says that all countries benefit when they import the resources they naturally lack. If we don't have labor, then we should import goods which are made by labor. If we don't have capital, then we should import goods which are made by capital. If we have more capital, then we should export goods made by capital. That's how the theory goes, and we'll be explaining more. The Heckscher-Ohlin explains that it is differences in factor endowment. So what is factor endowment? Just look into this box. A factor endowment in economics is commonly understood to be the amount of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship that a country possesses and can exploit for manufacturing. So factor endowments in the sense that the amount of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship that we have, the amount of factors of production that we have. So Heckscher-Ohlin explained that it is differences in factor endowments of different countries and different factor proportions needed for producing different commodities that account for difference in comparative cost. So what was the reason set by Heckscher and Ohlin for the differences in comparative cost? The reason is that the amount of factor of production is different in each country. In some countries we have more capital, in some countries we have more labor, and in some countries we have more land, and in that way the factor endowment is different in different countries, and also the different factor proportions are needed So because of a difference in factor endowments, the factor proportions that we use for the producing a particular good is also different when it comes to one and the other country. Ohlin asserts that there does not exist any basic difference between the domestic trade and international trade. According to Ohlin, he says that there is no difference between domestic trade and international trade. In the sense, indeed, according to him, international trade is only a special case of inter-regional trade. So he says that international trade is an upgraded or an updated version of inter-regional trade. He says that when a country is big, of course, the furthest parts of that countries will have different types of resources. So inter-regional trade or domestic trade is same as international trade. In international trade, you consider different countries, and in inter-regional trade, you take different locations, different specific regions in a country. So there is not much difference when it comes to inter-regional trade and international trade, as said by Ohlin. There are four main theorems in HO model. HO model is an umbrella model, and in HO model we have four major theorems. The first one is the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. The second one is Stolper-Samuelson theorem. The third one is Robinsky theorem, and the fourth one is factor price equalization theorem. So four theorems come under HO model. The Stolper-Samuelson and the Robinsky theorems describe relationship between variables in model, while the HO and factor price equalization theorems present some of the key results of the model. So we'll just in this video we'll be discussing about the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, and in the other videos, in each videos we'll be discussing each of these theorems. So hope that each and every point till now is clear to you. We are going deep into the theorem, the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. The HO theorem says that. So what does the HO theorem, the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem says is that a capital abundant country will export capital intensive good, while the labor abundant country will export the labor intensive good. So if a country has more capital, it will produce more capital intensive good and will export that good. And if a country has more labor than capital, then it will be producing more labor intensive good and it will export labor intensive commodities. According to Ricardo and other classical economists, international trade is based on differences in comparative cost. So this is how differences in comparative cost results in international trade. It is important to note that the Heckscher and Ohlin agreed with these fundamental propositions and only elaborated this by explaining the factors which cause differences in comparative cost. So Heckscher and Ohlin did not contradict Ricardo's theory, but they elaborated his theory by explaining the reason for differences in comparative cost. Ricardo and others who followed him explained differences in comparative cost as arising from differences in skill and efficiency of labor alone. But what Ricardo and others did is that they explain differences in comparative cost as differences in skill and efficiency of labor alone. So the skill and the efficiency of labor in different countries might be different, and Ricardo and others who followed him explained that as the only reason for the difference in the comparative cost. But this is not a satisfactory explanation. And what Ohlin and Heckscher and Ohlin did is that they pointed out more significant factors, that is namely differences in factor endowments. That means the amount of factor of production available in a country, and the differences in factor propositions. Propositions in the sense that the difference in the combination. For example, if we are producing a good in country A and another and the same good in country B, as there exists the differences in factor endowments, the factor proposition for the same good in both countries will also be different, of producing different commodities which account for differences in comparative cost. So that's the result, the reason for differences in comparative cost, and hence from the ultimate basis of interregional or international trade. This Heckscher-Ohlin theory does not contradict but supplant comparative supplant a comparative cost theory, but supplements it. So what we said in this point is that HO theorem is not a contradiction to Ricardo's theorem, but it's supplementing it with more reasons and more practical examples. By offering sufficiently satisfactory examples, explanation of what causes differences in comparative cost. According to Ohlin, the underlying forces behind differences in comparative cost are twofold. So we can specifically point out two reasons for the difference in comparative cost. As we said, the different regions or countries have different factor endowments or the amount of factor. The second point, different goods require different factor proposition for their production. Same thing that we said. Some countries possess relatively more capital, some relatively more labor, and some relatively more land. The factor which is relatively abundant in a country will tend to have a lower price. If we have more capital in our country, then the price of capital will be less. If we have more labor in our country, then the price of labor or wage rate will be less. The factor which is relatively scarce will tend to have a higher weight. If a particular factor is less in our country, then its price will be more because its demand will be more. Thus, according to Ohlin, factor endowments and factor prices are intimately associated with each other. So we are going into an example. We are providing an example. Suppose K stands for the availability or supply of capital in a country. Okay, so K stands for capital, and L for that of labor. L stands for labor, and PK for price of capital, and PL for the price of labor. Okay, so K for capital, L for labor, PK for price of capital, and PL for price of labor. Further, two countries A and B. So we are also considering two countries, country A and country B. In country A, capital is relatively abundant. In country A, capital is abundant, and country B, labor is abundant. So in country A, capital is abundant and labor is scarce, and in country B, labor is abundant and capital is scarce. Given this factor endowments, in country A, capital will be relatively cheaper. So in country A, as capital is abundant, capital will be cheaper. That is, the price of capital will be less, and price of labor will be more. In country B, price of labor will be less because it is a labor abundant country, and price of capital will be more. So we can form a simple equation in symbolic terms, since K by L, that is the capital labor ratio of country A, will be more than capital labor ratio of country B. So how does this come, the capital labor ratio? Since in country A capital is more and labor is less, and in country B capital is less and labor is more. So the capital labor ratio of country A will be more than the capital labor ratio of country B. And again, PK, what is PK? Price of capital by price of labor in country A, and PK by PL in country B. So PK by PL, price of capital to price of labor in country A, will be less than the price of capital to price of labor in country B. What's the reason here? As in country A, capital is abundant, so the price will be less, and with compared to price of labor, the price of labor in country A will be more because labor is scarce. That's how this equation is formed. Thus, a country A, which has a relative abundance of capital and relative scarcity of labor, will have a comparative advantage in specializing in the production of capital intensive commodities, and in return will import labor intensive goods. This is because, as we said, Pk by Pl of country A is less than Pk by Pl of country B. So in country A, there is a relative abundance of capital and there is a scarcity of labor. So country A will produce more capital intensive good and they will export capital intensive good, and they will not produce, they will produce less in labor, as labor is scarce in their country, so they will import labor intensive goods. On the other hand, a labor abundant country, in a labor abundant country, that is country B, with a scarcity of capital is very less and labor is more, will have a comparative advantage. So they will have an advantage in specializing in the production of labor intensive commodities. Country A will have an advantage in the production of capital intensive good, and country B will have an advantage in the production of labor intensive commodities. And as they have an advantage, they will export them, they will export some quantities of labor intensive commodities to the other country, and in exchange they will import capital intensive good because capital is very scarce in their country. This is because in this country PL, price of labor by price of capital, in country B is less than price of labor and by price of capital in country A. So hope that this symbolic explanation using the equation is clear to you. Now let's go to the graphical representation. This is a basic graph that explains HO model. Let us graphically explain the Heckscher-Ohlin theory of international trade. Take two countries, we are considering two countries, that is country USA and India, and of course, as we know, assume that there is a relative abundance of capital and scarcity of labor in US. So US is a capital abundant country and labor is very less, and on the other hand there is a relative abundance of labor and scarcity of capital in India. So India is a labor abundant country and capital is scarce. USA is a capital abundant country and labor is scarce. Of course, this is the real situation. Given this factor endowments, we have drawn the production possibility curve. In this graph, we have drawn the production possibility curve, just also known as the transformation curve between two commodities. Here we are considering two commodities, clothes and machines. Cloth, as you know, it is a labor abundant, labor intensive commodity, cloth, because rather than capital machines, we require more labor, more laborers, more workers in order to make clothes. And when it comes to machine, we use technology, more capital intensive technology, capital intensive machines in order to produce other machines. So the production possibility curve of USA is AB, that is the red red colored production possibility is of USA, and of India, that is PQ, that is of green color, as you can see. So on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, we can see it's the cloth is produced or cloth is calculated on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we consider it as machines. So the production possibility curve AB, that is the production possibility curve of USA, is more on the side of machine because it is a capital abundant country and it produces more of the machines. When it comes to production possibility curve of India, we can see it is more on the side of clothes because it is a labor abundant country. India is a labor abundant country and USA is a capital abundant country. It produces more of USA produces more of machines and less of cloth, and India produces more of cloth and less of machines. Since two countries have different factor endowments, production possibility curves will differ. As we said, the production possibility curve is different in both countries. The relative production possibility curve AB of USA shows that given its factor endowments, USA can produce relatively more of capital intensive commodity machines and relatively less of labor intensive commodity clothes. So this is how, as we can see, yes, as we can see here in the machines, USA produces more machines, that is A and O. In this level, USA can produce machines, but it can produce clothes, that is only OB, which is less in amount. When it comes to India, that is the PQ. India can produce OQ amount. India can produce OQ amount of clothes, but it can only produce OP amount of machines. That's how it goes. On the contrary, India can produce relatively more of labor-intensive commodity clothes and relatively less of capital-intensive commodity machines. Point M and M1 is the production. So we are considering two situations. Only we said that only we have two countries, two factors of production and two commodities. So we are considering two situations. Situation 1, in which there is no trade between India and USA, and situation 2, when there is trade between India and USA. So we have 2 points M and M1 is the production when there is no trade or autarky. So we have 2 points M and M1. So we have 2 points M and M1, and it shows that, yes, here, okay, fine. So you have the point M here, you have the point M1 here. So when there is no trade between India and USA, both countries will be producing at this point of their production possibility curve, because as there is no trade, both countries will have to produce machines and clothes. They need both machines and clothes, so they will be producing at this point. Okay, so after that, when there is trade, okay, so after the establishment of trade between two countries, so when both these countries start to indulge in trade, USA specializes in the production of machines and it reaches point N. India specializes in the production of clothes and has reached point N1. Okay, so what happened is that, as you can see at point N, when both countries get into international trade, USA will specialize in the production of machines because it is a capital abundant country and it will produce capital intensive good and it will reach the point N. And on the other hand, India will reach the point N1 because it is a labor abundant country and it will be producing labor intensive good, that is cloth, and will reach at the point N1 in the production possibility curve, and USA will reach point N on its production possibility curve. And where the production possibility curve of the two countries are tangent to the common price line PB, which is also international terms of trade. So you can see this widened line. This is the line PB, price line, or the line. Both the points N and N1 will be tangent to this line. This line is also the international terms of trade. This is how it occurs when there is international trade and each country specializes in the production of each commodity. USA will export machines in exchange for clothes. So when there is international trade, USA will be producing more of the machines and less of clothes, and USA will export machines and it will import clothes and consume at the point E on the indifference curve of IZ2. On the other hand, India will export clothes for machines. So India will export clothes and India will import machines and consume at E1, which coincides with the point E. Both countries gain from the trade because they consume on higher indifference curve. So just look at this. Both countries, uh, after reaching the position N and N1, we know that they will produce machines more. USA will produce machines more, and India will produce clothes more. On the other hand, after production, what they will do is that the excess amount of machines, USA will export the excess amount of machines to India, and India will export the excess amount of clothes to USA. So they will technically reach at a point E with a higher indifference curve, because at point E they produce and they consume, they produce equal amounts of machines, they can use equal amounts of machine and clothes, because USA, even though it's only producing machine, it export machines to India, and India, even though only producing clothes, it export clothes to USA. So both countries will have both amount of goods, and they will be consuming both goods at a point E, and that point E is on a higher indifference curve. So that's how HO theorem, or the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, works. There are many criticism, and one of the main criticism of HO theorem is the Leontief paradox, which was put forward by Vasily Leontief. We will be discussing Leontief paradox in our next video. So this is how the HO theorem works. Hope that each and every point is clear to you. You can clear your doubts using the command session, or you can mail me your doubts at aminmsai@gmail.com. Hope everything is clear. I would request you to share, like, and subscribe my channel and the videos. Thank you. See you in the next video.